Just queuing that up. Right, we are live and we're welcoming people who may be joining us online or maybe joining us later on. I'm Linda, I'm one of the lay ministers here. You are joining the service at St Mary's, Osterley. And if you are joining us online, if you want to use the comments in the comment box, just to let us know how you have engaged with the service this morning. And just a little recap. If you've been joining us online over the summer holidays, we've been running this series looking at what we do when we worship. And if we could have the next slide, please, Mark. So this Sunday, we're looking at why we break bread. Why we break bread. I don't think it's gone on to the next slide, Mark. There we are. So why we break bread. Okay. One of the central elements to when we worship together, but not every time we worship. We come to maybe a particular service for the breaking of bread. And it might be helpful to know what we're talking about when we say breaking bread. So next slide, please, Mark. We have different names, different denominations, different parts of the church will refer to this breaking of bread in different ways. It doesn't matter which one you use, whether you use Holy Communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the bread and wine, they all mean the same thing. They're all about when Jesus gathered with his disciples on the last time he ate together with them before he died, and he took bread and wine, and we're going to look at that a little bit more. But for us, celebrating communion, and that's the phrase I'm going to use, it's about being part of our worshiping life together. It's about what we do when we gather as a family. I'm going to have a little look in a moment about where we get some of the words that we use when we gather to break bread and when we use it in our communion services. So I'm going to invite Steve to come up and read from us from 1 Corinthians. Thank you, Steve.
So this is a reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, reading from chapter 11, beginning at verse 23. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Steve. So that's some verses that you may be familiar with as you've heard the communion prayer being prayed. And later on, when Ellis comes to celebrate communion for us and with us, you will maybe hear some of those words again, because they are key. And we'll look at those a little bit more in detail later. But for now, let's get a bit curious. And I've got some ideas for if you would just gather in twos, maybe threes, just don't leave anybody in their own, to have a look at these questions together. What is the best meal for you? Why? What makes it so special? Is it a one-off meal or is it a regular meal? What one is it? And have you received an invitation to a meal or a celebration? And when you've been invited to something, how does that make you feel? And what does being asked to remember Jesus in the bread and the wine mean to you? Now we've got about 4 or 5 minutes. It's a quick dive, or you might want to just focus on one of those. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to get together and talk about that. So off you go. Well, it looks like there's a lot of sharing going on, and that's really great. And I hope you've been able to share some of your thoughts. I'm not going to ask you to feed back to me now, but continue to think about that as we go through this morning and maybe later in today. And if you are joining us online, do put those comments in the comment box. You know, what was your best favourite meal? What does it feel to be invited and so on? So let's have a little think then about why it is that we break bread together. Now, Steve says, that's my husband, that I have an encyclopedic memory of food and meals. And to an extent, that is true. Partly because I do enjoy food, but more for me, it's the occasion. It's the company. Daphne and I were talking a bit over there. It can be who's there at the table. It takes you back to a time and a place. And often the smell of food or the taste of food is very evocative. I mean, I don't know how many of you that if they smell something or taste something, you're taken back to a time and place. One of the ones for me, funny enough, is maraschino cherries. Now, if you don't know what they are, they come in a little jar and they're in like an almondy liquor. And they take, the moment I smell those, I am 8 or 9 years old again, and it's Christmas, and I am having the weakest snowball drink, which if anybody know what that is, it's lemonade, a tiny bit of alcohol, but the moment I crack open a jar, that is where I am. So you all may have your own place, time, where food takes you. And it's about memory, isn't it? It's about remembering. And that's why it's very important that people who move to other countries, move to foreign lands, will often try to recreate the foods and the tastes of their homeland, because it brings memory, it brings comfort, it brings the ability to keep traditions alive. So memory is important, and food really helps with that. So I'm going to move on to a slide in a moment that has a verse from Luke's Gospel, and I'm going to read it for you so that people can hear it and see it. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant of my blood." And I've highlighted that word, do this in remembrance, because Jesus is asking us to remember. He's inviting us to remember him every time we break the bread and share the wine. We now have a service around that we call communion. But it would have become quite established in the early church. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But what are we being asked to remember, and why? We're being asked that his body is broken for us and his blood is being poured out. It's a new covenant. That's what we're being asked to remember. His sacrifice. And on the screen now is one of my favourite paintings of the Last Supper. It's by an artist called Stanley Spencer. He painted it in 1920. And it pictures Jesus there with his disciples around him, and he is in the centre of the cross part of the table. And what you're seeing is that Jesus has taken the bread and in his hands, and as he has broken it, if you can notice, it opens up almost like a book. The way he's breaking it, it almost looks like he's got a book in his hands. And that reminds me that of the opening words from John's Gospel. The Word became flesh. In the beginning, it said, was the Word, and the Word was God, with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, with God, all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of the people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall not overcome it. Those are amazing words. This is who we're talking about. The Word of God made flesh is here sitting at a table, breaking bread. And when you break bread, or when you are broken, being broken is messy. It's very messy, and it's painful. If you have been broken physically, emotionally, mentally, it is painful. So Jesus knows that in breaking, there is pain. And the bread that Jesus is breaking here is not like our soft supermarket bread. And it's not even like the wafers that we will use later for communion. This takes a bit of effort to break this bread. And when you break it, it gets messy. Crumbs and crust will go everywhere. It won't be neat. And that's what we're being asked to remember in the breaking of the bread, that Jesus going to the cross, his death will not be neat. It will be messy. It will be painful. And it is for us. It's a dramatic and visual symbol that helps the disciples and us remember what Jesus has done. And in the same way that the Passover meal enabled the Hebrews to remember being rescued from Egypt, and they would celebrate a Passover every year with symbolic food and tell the story of what had happened. So, the simple act of breaking bread and sharing wine helps us to remember what has happened. Every time we get together and say the words, we are caused to remember what Jesus has done for us, and that in his death and his resurrection, we have been saved from death and we have been given new life. And Paul says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So that's what we're doing. That's why we are breaking bread. We're doing it to remember. So we were invited to remember. Did we do it? Well, the early church did, and there's a reading verse in Acts that tells us how they did do that. So if we could have the next slide, yeah. In Acts 2:42, it says the early church, as they gathered, they devoted themselves to the apostles, teaching and fellowship. They had that together. To the breaking of bread and prayers. Now sometimes in the early church, this would have been in-house fellowship. There wouldn't have been a beautiful building to meet in. It would have been in each other's houses, and possibly as part of a wider meal at first. But it was the gathering together, the coming together to be fed, to share and to receive that was important. And even today in some underground churches, this is the way people break bread, in fear of being discovered. But they still do it because Jesus asked us to do it. He asks us to remember. And this invitation Jesus made when he took the bread and broke it at the table, saying to them, "Take and eat in remembrance of me," is the same invitation that we have today. In that picture that we had earlier, the Jesus sitting at the table, breaking the bread, it's the same invitation. It is renewed and it's refreshed. And no matter when, we are being invited to be part of that meal down through the generations. And a few weeks ago, Steve and I were visiting another church, and this is the invitation that they used before receiving communion. And it made me stop and think about how I come to receive, how I am when I come to take that little bit of bread or that little bit of wafer and that little tincture of wine. How am I responding to this invitation? So let me just read what they had put in their service book. So this would have been as the table was being prepared and we were being invited to partake. The table of bread and wine is now being made ready. So come to this table, you who have much faith, and you who would like to have more. You who have been here often, and you who have not been for a while. You who have tried to follow Jesus, and you who have failed. Come. It is Christ who invites us to meet him here. So that's what we're coming to when we break bread, when we come to communion. I am just so thankful I don't have to have passed a test or come in a particular state of being. I don't have to come with pretense that I am somehow different to who I am, that there is no shame. And maybe the thing that I'm imagining is when I come to take that piece of wafer and that little dip of wine, is to imagine there's Jesus at the table breaking the bread again. And for me, it's reminding me in those two very simple symbols that he gave everything for us. He gave everything for me. That's why we break bread, to remember, to be fed, to be strengthened. So in a moment, we're going to sing a song. It's been recorded for us by Sally, who can't be here today. It's a well-known one, Broken for Me, Broken for You. If you want to stay seated and prayerfully sing it as a response to what you've heard today, that's absolutely fine. If you want to stand, please stand, and we will sing together, Broken for Me, Broken for You.
Body of Jesus.
be seated. So you've been doing some listening. Now it's your time to do some sharing and a little thinking about what you've heard this morning. And we're going to bring up some questions here, some prompts. Maybe share in 2s and 3s again what you've heard that excites you. What are you going to remember? It might be something you found out new today. And what are you going to do next? So we're going to have a few minutes together talking. So if you would like to do that, and if you are online, if you would like to put anything in the comments, please do. So while you carry on talking, I am going to say goodbye to our online community and say do join us again next Sunday, where we'll have our last in the series, and it will be Why We Scatter. So I say goodbye, God bless.